April 1945. Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. Soviet forces are closing in. American and British forces have crossed the Rhine. Germany is surrounded. Hitler remains in Berlin, refusing to surrender, refusing to flee. The Soviet army launches the final assault. Operation Berlin. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of artillery pieces. They converge on Berlin, the capital of the Nazi regime. What happens next is one of history's most brutal urban battles. The collapse context asterisk. Germany is collapsing on all fronts. In the West, American and British forces are advancing rapidly. In the East, Soviet forces are advancing rapidly. The Third Reich is dying. Everyone understands this. But Hitler orders Berlin defended. Orders fighting to the last man. The strategic situation asterisk. Berlin is militarily indefensible. The city is surrounded. Escape is impossible. But the Nazis will fight anyway. Will defend the city block by block, building by building. The defense is not military strategy. It's ideology that it's Hitler refusing to surrender. The Soviet forces are enormous. 2.5 million soldiers. 6,000 plus tanks and self-propelled guns. 40,000 plus artillery pieces. 7,500 plus aircraft. The forces are overwhelming. Germany cannot match them. The German forces available asterisk. Germany has forces in Berlin. Hitler youth, teenagers drafted at the last moment. Wehrmacht veterans, depleted, exhausted. SS fanatics, ideologically committed to fighting to the death. Volkssturm, civilian militia, mostly untrained. The total German force, maybe 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers. The force is vastly outnumbered. Poorly equipped, mostly inexperienced. The fortifications asterisk. Berlin has been partially fortified. Barricades, tank traps, anti-tank guns, machine gun positions. But the fortifications are inadequate, incomplete. The fortifications cannot stop the Soviet assault, but will slow it. The civilian population asterisk. Berlin has 2 to 3 million civilians. The civilians are in the crossfire, caught between German defending and Soviet attacking. The civilian casualty toll will be enormous. The Hitler factor asterisk. Hitler remains in his bunker. The Führer bunker. Hitler refuses to surrender. Refuses to flee. That Hitler's refusal to surrender condemns Berlin to destruction. Hitler's stubbornness seals the city's fate. German soldiers know the war is lost. Fighting in Berlin is not to win, is to delay. Is to die. German morale is shattered, but orders must be followed. German soldiers fight despite knowing defeat is inevitable. The Soviet determination asterisk. The Soviets are determined to capture Berlin. Berlin is the Nazi capital, the symbol of Nazi power. Capturing Berlin would end the war in Europe. The Soviets want the glory of capturing Berlin. Want to plant the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. The historical significance asterisk. The Battle of Berlin is symbolically significant. World War II in Europe. Asterisk asterisk. It represents the timeline asterisk asterisk. It represents the end of Nazi Germany. The battle will last about 10 days, April 16th to May 2nd. 10 days of intense urban fighting. 10 days that will determine Berlin's fate. 10 days that will determine Germany's fate. The intensity preview asterisk. The battle will be intense. More intense than anything seen before. Urban warfare is brutal. House-to-house fighting. Block by block fighting. The intensity will exceed even Eastern Front battles. The casualties will be enormous. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945. The Soviet forces launched their assault on multiple fronts. The city was surrounded. Escape was impossible. Surrender was not an option, according to Hitler. The Soviet offensive plan asterisk. The Soviet plan. Attack from all directions. Encircle the city. Compress the perimeter. Soviet forces would attack from the north, from the east, from the south. The German forces would be squeezed into smaller and smaller area. Eventually, German forces would be pushed into the city center. German forces resisted. The German resistance was fierce, but futile. German anti-tank guns killed Soviet tanks. But more Soviet tanks came. German infantry killed Soviet soldiers. But more Soviet soldiers came. The weight of numbers was overwhelming. Asterisk asterisk. The Vistula Oder offensive background asterisk asterisk. The Soviet forces fighting at Berlin had just completed the Vistula Oder offensive. That offensive had brought Soviet forces to within 65 kilometers of Berlin. Now, they would cover the final 65 kilometers through Berlin. The Soviet momentum asterisk. Soviet forces had been advancing for months. The momentum was with the Soviets. The momentum was powerful. German forces were retreating. Defending. The momentum was crushing German resistance. The first days, April 16th to 17th. The first Soviet assaults achieved breakthrough. German defenses were broken in multiple locations. Soviet forces poured through the breakthrough, advanced into Berlin. German forces tried to contain the breakthrough. Couldn't. The Spree River crossing asterisk. A major river, the Spree, ran through Berlin. Soviet forces had to cross it to advance deeper into the city. The crossing was difficult, opposed, costly, but Soviet engineers built bridges. Soviet forces crossed. German forces established defensive lines behind the Spree. The Spree became a defensive line, a barrier, but the barrier was breached. Soviet forces crossed. German defensive lines collapsed. The Soviet objective, capture the Reichstag. The Reichstag was the symbol of German power. Capturing it would symbolize Nazi defeat. The Reichstag would be heavily defended. The fighting caused enormous damage. Soviet artillery bombardment was intense. Continuous. Buildings were destroyed. Set on fire. The city was being demolished building by building. Civilians were caught in the fighting. Some were killed by Soviet fire, some by German fire. Some committed suicide, fearing Soviet capture. The civilian casualty toll was enormous. The Soviet forces suffered heavy casualties. German defenders killed Soviet soldiers. Anti-tank guns destroyed Soviet tanks. Soviet casualties were in the tens of thousands. The casualty toll was enormous. But Soviet reinforcements replaced the losses. German forces suffered enormous casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. German forces were being destroyed. Eliminated by day 3 or 4. German organized resistance was nearly gone. As the fighting continued, Soviet forces tightened the encirclement. German forces were pushed into smaller and smaller area. Escape became impossible. German forces were trapped. Soviet forces advanced steadily, slowly, but inexorably. More territory was captured. More German forces were destroyed. German forces established defensive lines behind the Spree. The Spree became a defensive line, a barrier, but the barrier was breached. Soviet forces crossed. German defensive lines collapsed. The Soviet objective, capture the Reichstag. The Reichstag was the symbol of German power. Capturing it would symbolize Nazi defeat. The Reichstag would be heavily defended. The fighting caused enormous damage. Soviet artillery bombardment was intense. Continuous. Buildings were destroyed. Set on fire. The city was being demolished building by building. Civilians were caught in the fighting. Some were killed by Soviet fire, some by German fire. Some committed suicide, fearing Soviet capture. The civilian casualty toll was enormous. The Soviet forces suffered heavy casualties. German defenders killed Soviet soldiers. Anti-tank guns destroyed Soviet tanks. Soviet casualties were in the tens of thousands. The casualty toll was enormous. But Soviet reinforcements replaced the losses. German forces suffered enormous casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. German forces were being destroyed. Eliminated by day 3 or 4. German organized resistance was nearly gone. As the fighting continued, Soviet forces tightened the encirclement. German forces were pushed into smaller and smaller area. Escape became impossible. German forces were trapped. Soviet forces advanced steadily, slowly, but inexorably. More territory was captured. More German forces were destroyed. The final phase of the Battle of Berlin was the Reichstag capture. The Reichstag was heavily defended. The last German strongpoint. The Reichstag's significance. The Reichstag was the symbol of German power, of Nazi rule. Capturing it would end the war symbolically. The Soviets wanted to capture it. Plant the Soviet flag on it. The Reichstag defenses. German forces prepared extensive defenses. Machine gun positions. Anti-tank guns. Barricades. The building was fortified as much as possible. The Soviet artillery preparation. Soviet forces prepared for the assault. Artillery bombardment was massive, continuous. The Soviet assault. Soviet forces assaulted the Reichstag. Infantry attacked. Tanks provided fire support. The assault was violent. Intense, bloody. German defenders fought, then surrendered or fled. The Reichstag capture *. The Reichstag was captured on April 30th to May 2nd. Soviet soldiers planted the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. The symbol of Nazi power had fallen. The war in Europe was effectively over. The Hitler death *. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. Hitler shot himself. His wife Goebbels committed suicide with him. Hitler's body was burned by staff members. Hitler died as his empire collapsed. ***. The flag-raising photo ***. The iconic photo of Soviet soldiers raising the Soviet flag on the Reichstag was taken. The photo became the symbol of Soviet victory. The photo endured, became historically famous. The Battle of Berlin was not one battle. It was a series of fierce engagements. House-to-house fighting. Building by building fighting. Street by street fighting. ***. The urban warfare difficulty ***. Urban warfare is the most difficult form of warfare. The attacker must clear each building, each room. The defender can position forces in buildings, can defend from prepared positions. Urban warfare is brutal, costly, intense. ***. The Soviet tactics ***. Soviet tactics, overwhelming firepower. Artillery bombardment to destroy buildings, kill defenders. Tank fire to suppress defenses. Infantry assault to capture buildings. The tactics were brutal, effective, overwhelming. ***. The German counterattacks ***. German tactics, improvised defense. Using buildings as fortifications, positioning anti-tank guns on streets. Fighting from building to building, room to room. The tactics were sound, but were overwhelmed by Soviet firepower. The street-by-street advance ***. Soviet forces advanced street by street. One street would be secured. The next street attacked. German defenders would fight, then retreat to the next street. The retreat was orderly, but continuous. The barricade effectiveness ***. German forces built barricades in streets. Tank traps, barbed wire, machine gun positions. The barricades slowed Soviet advance. But Soviet forces overwhelmed the barricades. The building-to-building destruction ***. Buildings were being destroyed systematically. Soviet artillery would bombard buildings. Infantry would assault the ruins. Buildings would be cleared of defenders. The city was being demolished, building by building. The Reichstag approach ***. As Soviet forces advanced, the Reichstag approached. The Reichstag was the final objective, the symbol. German forces prepared the final defense. The Reichstag would be defended to the last man. The soldier motivation ***. Soviet soldiers were motivated. They were fighting the last battle of the war. They wanted to capture Berlin, capture the Reichstag. The motivation was strong. The German soldier motivation ***. German soldiers were exhausted. Defeated, they knew the war was lost. Fighting in Berlin was not to win, was to die. Motivation was low, but orders must be followed. The civilian escape attempts ***. Civilians tried to escape Berlin. They fled west, toward American lines. Some escaped. Many were caught in fighting, killed. The civilian exodus added to the chaos. The fire spread ***. Fighting caused fires. Buildings burned, fires spread. The city was becoming a firestorm. The heat and smoke added to the horror. The hospital situation. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The wounded poured in continuously. Hospitals were bombed, destroyed, evacuated. The wounded had nowhere to go. The water shortage. Water supplies were destroyed. Fighting damaged water pipes, made water unavailable. Without water, fighting fires was impossible. Without water, medical care was difficult. Sanitation was impossible. The food shortage. Food supplies were exhausted. Civilians and soldiers were hungry. Looting of stores, fighting over food. Starvation was a reality. The psychological pressure. The psychological pressure was immense. Constant bombardment. Continuous fighting. No escape. The pressure was breaking people. Psychologically, suicide became common, especially among civilians, even among military. The communication breakdown. Communications between units were breaking down. Orders couldn't be transmitted. Units couldn't coordinate. Chaos was increasing. Control was slipping away. The Hitler bunker isolation. Hitler was isolated in his bunker. Hitler received distorted reports, refused to accept reality. Hitler believed miraculous weapons would save Germany. Hitler believed phantom armies would defend Berlin. Hitler lived in fantasy while Berlin was destroyed. The surrender debates. Berlin's defenders debated surrender. Some wanted to surrender, save lives. Some wanted to fight, follow Hitler's orders. The debate continued while the city was destroyed. The end in sight. By April 24th to 25th, the end was in sight. Soviet forces had captured most of the city. German defense was collapsing, surrenders were increasing. The battle was nearly over. The final phase of the Battle of Berlin was the Reichstag capture. The Reichstag was heavily defended. The last German strongpoint. The Reichstag's significance. The Reichstag was the symbol of German power, of Nazi rule. Capturing it would end the war symbolically. Plant the Soviet flag on it. The symbolic importance matched the military importance. The Reichstag defenses. German forces prepared extensive defenses. Barricades. The building was fortified as much as possible. The Soviet artillery preparation. Soviet forces prepared for the assault. Artillery bombardment was massive, continuous. The bombardment was intended to destroy German defenses, demoralize German soldiers. The Soviet assault. Soviet forces assaulted the Reichstag. Infantry attacked. Tanks provided fire support. The assault was violent, intense, bloody. German defenders fought, then surrendered or fled. The Reichstag capture. The Reichstag was captured on April 30th to May 2nd. Soviet soldiers planted the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. The symbol of Nazi power had fallen. The war in Europe was effectively over. The Hitler death. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. Hitler shot himself. His wife Goebbels committed suicide with him. Hitler's body was burned by staff members. Hitler died as his empire collapsed. The flag-raising photo. The iconic photo of Soviet soldiers raising the Soviet flag on the Reichstag was taken. The photo became the symbol of Soviet victory. The photo endured, became historically famous. The final German defense. German forces continued fighting after the Reichstag fell. But German command structure was collapsing. Surrender negotiations began. The fighting continued. But the outcome was clear. The final surrender. German forces in Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. The Battle of Berlin was over. The Third Reich was dead. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7th to 8th. The casualty toll. The Battle of Berlin casualties were enormous. German, 100,000 plus, killed, wounded, missing. Civilian, 300,000 plus, killed, died in fighting, died from other causes. The total, over 700,000 casualties. The destruction. Berlin was largely destroyed. Buildings were in ruins, streets were destroyed. The city that had been the capital of an empire was devastated. The war's end in Europe. The Battle of Berlin marked the end of World War II in Europe. With Berlin captured and Hitler dead, the Nazi government was destroyed. German forces surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The global war would continue. Pacific War continued until August 1945. But the European war was finished. The Soviet dominance. The Soviet capture of Berlin demonstrated Soviet military dominance. Soviet victory in the East was complete, absolute. The Soviet army was powerful. Soviet forces would occupy Eastern Europe for 45 years. The Soviet occupation of Berlin and Eastern Europe determined the post-war world. Soviet forces occupied Berlin, divided it with Western allies. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe. Berlin was divided into 4 occupation zones: American Zone, British Zone, French Zone, Soviet Zone. Eventually, Berlin would be the symbol of Cold War division. Berlin Wall built in 1961. Soviet forces committed war crimes in Berlin. Rape, murder, plunder. War crimes also occurred in the retreat west by German forces. The war's brutality extended to the very end. The Battle of Berlin was Hitler's final lesson. Refusing to surrender, ordering pointless defense, condemning millions to death, all for ideology, for pride. The Battle of Berlin is remembered as for refusal to accept reality. The final major battle of World War II in Europe. The symbol of Nazi collapse. The beginning of Soviet post-war dominance. One of the most brutal urban battles in history. A demonstration of the horror of war. The memory endures. Flak towers. Anti-aircraft guns. Fighter aircraft. But by April, the air defenses were nearly gone. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies freely. The Soviet artillery bombardment. Soviet artillery bombardment was the most intense of the war. Thousands of artillery pieces, continuous fire. The bombardment was intended to break German resistance, demoralize German soldiers. The bombardment was effective. Buildings were obliterated, defenses destroyed. The psychological warfare. Soviet forces used psychological warfare. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals. Leaflets were distributed, offering safe passage to surrenders. Some German soldiers surrendered, many continued fighting. The command structure collapse. German command structure was collapsing. Communications were breaking down. Orders were unclear. Some units received orders. Others didn't. Coordination became impossible. The unit fragmentation. As the battle continued, German units fragmented. Companies became separated from battalions. Platoons became separated from companies. Small groups fought independently, without overall coordination. The surrenders. As the battle continued, German surrenders increased. Individual soldiers surrendered. Small groups surrendered. Entire units surrendered. By the end, surrender became normal. The last defenses. The last German defenses were around the city center. Government buildings, the Reichstag, the Chancellery. These areas were defended desperately. But the defense was futile. Numbers were overwhelming. The Chancellery fall. The Reich Chancellery, the government building, was captured on April 30th to May 1st. Hitler was in the nearby bunker when it fell. The fall of the Chancellery meant Hitler's government was destroyed. The Reichstag final assault. The final assault on the Reichstag began on April 30th. Soviet forces attacked from multiple directions. German defenders fought desperately. The fighting was the most intense of the entire battle. The red flag placement. Soviet soldiers captured the Reichstag on May 2nd. Red flags were placed on the roof. The last combat. Fighting continued even after major objectives were captured. Small groups of German soldiers continued fighting. From buildings, from rubble. They were killed, captured, or surrendered. The organized surrender. By May 2nd, organized German surrender began. German commanders negotiated terms. German forces laid down arms. The battle was effectively over. The formal surrender date. The official surrender of Berlin was May 2nd. All fighting in Berlin ceased. German forces were taken prisoner. The city fell silent. The orders to the bitter end. Hitler ordered Berlin defended to the last man. Orders to fight to the death. Orders. No surrender. No retreat. Orders that condemned hundreds of thousands to death. The staff breakdown. As the battle progressed, Hitler's staff broke down. Some lost composure, shouted, wept, some plotted, considered disobedience. Some simply followed orders, mechanically, without hope. The final days in the bunker. The final days were chaotic. Reports of Soviet advances. Orders issued. Reality denied. Tempers flared. Accusations flew. The bunker was a place of despair. Denial, delusion. The Speer defiance. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, defied Hitler. Speer sabotaged Hitler's order to destroy German infrastructure. Speer believed Germany would survive, could rebuild. Speer's defiance was significant, but changed nothing about the battle. The Göring departure. Hermann Göring left Berlin. Göring believed the war was lost. Göring headed south. To escape Soviet capture. Hitler was furious, had Göring removed from all offices. The Bormann survival. Martin Bormann remained with Hitler to the end. Bormann was Hitler's secretary. Hitler's keeper. After Hitler's death, Bormann would attempt to escape. Bormann would be killed in Berlin, though his body was never definitively found. The Goebbels tragedy. Joseph Goebbels remained with Hitler. After Hitler's death, Goebbels killed his 6 children. Then Goebbels and his wife committed suicide. The tragedy was complete. The Nazi regime deaths asterisk. High Nazi regime officials died in Berlin. Some committed suicide. Hitler, Goebbels, Goebbels' family. Some were executed by Soviet forces. By German soldiers. Some fled and were captured later. The war crime investigations asterisk. After the war, investigations into Berlin war crimes began. Soviet war crimes. Rape, murder, looting. German war crimes. Indiscriminate killing of civilians. Both sides committed atrocities. The victors' justice asterisk. The victors created tribunals. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted German leaders. The Soviet Union was a victor. Justice was unequal. The aftermath silence asterisk. After the battle, silence fell on Berlin. The city was destroyed, empty, silent. Ruins remained. Destruction remained. The city would need years to recover. The Soviet occupation asterisk. Soviet forces occupied Berlin. Looting, rape, murder continued for weeks. Soviet command ignored the crimes or encouraged them. The occupation was brutal. The Western entry American and British forces entered Berlin. They found Soviet occupation already underway. The Western Allies took control of their zones. Berlin was divided. The Cold War began. The recovery begins Over months, recovery began. Bodies were buried. Debris was cleared. Survivors emerged. Searched for family members. The recovery would take years. The displaced persons Millions were displaced by the Battle of Berlin and the end of the war. Refugees, prisoners of war, forced laborers, finding family, finding homes, finding new lives. The displacement was massive, complicated. The Soviet war trophies. Soviet forces looted Berlin. Art, valuables, industrial equipment. The looting was systematic, massive. The trophies were shipped to the Soviet Union. The Soviet glory. The Soviet forces celebrated the capture of Berlin. Parades, celebrations, recognition. The soldiers were heroes. The war was won. The glory was real. The victory was complete. The cost of the glory. The glory came at enormous cost. The war's end symbolized. The Battle of Berlin symbolized the war's end. Not just militarily, but symbolically. The fall of Berlin meant the fall of Nazism. The fall of the regime meant the end of the war in Europe. The historical turning point. The Battle of Berlin was the final turning point. From this point, the war was over in Europe. But the European war was finished. The lesson of urban warfare. The Battle of Berlin demonstrated urban warfare's horror. Attacker and defender both suffer enormously. Civilians suffer most of all. Urban warfare is the most destructive form of warfare.